Today, we're going to dive into the wild, 100-year history of modern Iraq, and we're going to do it by telling the story of its most notorious leader, Saddam Hussein, and the whole cycle of devastating wars that really defined his rise and his fall. So right off the bat, we're faced with this huge paradox. Why would America, as our sources claim, help create this incredibly powerful leader, only to turn around and spend billions of dollars and risk thousands of lives to take him down? It's a wild question, and it's really at the very heart of this entire story.
But look, to even begin to understand a man like Saddam, you first have to understand the country he came from. You see, Iraq's creation wasn't exactly smooth. It was born out of a collapsed empire and foreign meddling, which basically set the stage for decades of chaos.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It tells you everything you need to know about how turbulent Iraq's birth was. The Ottoman Empire falls apart in 1918, then Britain comes in and basically carves out the modern state of Iraq. What happens next is just a total whirlwind. They get independence in 32, they have a monarchy, then a violent military coup in 58, and finally, the Ba'ath Party takes over in 1968. All of this constant instability, it created the perfect power vacuum for someone ruthless to just step in and take control. And that someone, of course, was Saddam Hussein. So let's take a look at how this cruel, ambitious kid from a really tough background methodically and brutally clawed his way to the absolute top. Now, to get what was happening here, you've got to remember this is the height of the Cold War. At the time, Iraq's president was getting a little too friendly with the Soviet Union. And that, of course, made the U.S. really nervous. Our source material argues that the CIA was actively looking for a way to put a more pro-Western leader in charge to push back against the Soviets in the region.
His climb to the top wasn't luck. It was a cold, calculated strategy. You can see the steps right here. First, he works his way up the Ba'ath Party. Then, as vice president and head of intelligence, he starts building this terrifying network of fear, just systematically torturing and getting rid of anyone who stood in his way. And then, after a decade of grabbing power, he allegedly makes his final move, forcing the president to resign at gunpoint. Just like that, he had total control. And the second he became president, man, his ambition just went into overdrive. He saw himself as the future leader of the entire Arab world. And that desire, that ambition, would drag Iraq into two absolutely catastrophic wars. So in 1980, Saddam, a Sunni Arab nationalist, decides to invade his neighbor, Iran. Now, Iran had just had its Islamic Revolution, and it was now a Shia theocracy that was incredibly hostile to the U.S. This whole situation suddenly made Saddam a useful, if temporary, ally for America and for Arab states like Kuwait, because they were all terrified of Iran's new revolutionary government. But what Saddam thought would be a quick, easy victory? Nope. It turned into a brutal, bloody war of attrition that just dragged on for 8 long years. And the human cost, it's just staggering to think about. We're talking about an estimated 2 million people killed on both sides. A whole generation was basically lost to Saddam's ambition. And here's the crucial point. This is the part that changes everything. The war left Iraq with a crippling debt. It was about $80 billion back then. And guess who he owed most of that money to? His tiny, oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. So that massive debt, it's like the fuse on a bomb, just waiting to be lit for the next explosion. Saddam's argument was, hey, I fought this war to protect you guys from Iran, so you should just forgive the debt. Kuwait, well, they didn't see it that way. And things just escalated so fast. Kuwait demanded he pay up. Then, our sources claim, they started slant drilling to basically siphon oil from underneath Iraq's fields. They also flooded the market with cheap oil, which crashed prices and just wrecked Iraq's economy. Feeling totally betrayed and backed into a corner, Saddam did what he always did. He attacked. Invading Kuwait, that was the fatal mistake. It turned him from a sort of regional frenemy into an international villain overnight. And it kicked off a chain of events that, about a decade later, would lead to his complete and total downfall. Okay, so let's fast forward to 2003. After the 9/11 attacks, the United States started building its case for invading Iraq. And it was all centered on one single claim, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and he was ready to use them. The only problem with that justification? After the invasion, after years of searching every corner of the country, no stockpiles of WMDs were ever found. None. The whole reason for the war just wasn't there. So if it wasn't really about WMDs, then why invade? Well, the theory our sources present is that the real motive was all about money. The U.S. economy was struggling, and the goal, allegedly, was to get control of Iraq's huge reserves of oil and gold, basically using war as an economic tool. And from there, the end came pretty quickly. The U.S. invasion kicked off in March 2003. By December, Saddam, the man who once lived in palaces, was found hiding in a hole in the ground. After a 3-year trial for all his past crimes, the man who ruled Iraq with an iron fist was executed in December 2006.
But here's the thing. The fall of the dictator didn't bring the freedom and democracy everyone had promised. Instead, it created this massive power vacuum and unleashed a whole new level of chaos and violence.
And the human cost of what came next was it's hard to even comprehend. According to our sources, the years of war and occupation that came after Saddam was removed led to a level of death and destruction that was even worse than Saddam's own crimes. You see, when you tear down an entire country's government and you disband its army, you leave a void, and something will always rush in to fill that void. In this case, what rushed in was a new and maybe even more terrifying evil, the terrorist state of ISIS, which would go on to spread its horror across the globe.
So how does this all tie together? The source material claims that what happened in Iraq wasn't just a one-off thing, but it's part of a bigger pattern. It's like a playbook. As you can see here, a power like Britain first creates instability by drawing these artificial borders. Then, a power like the US steps into that chaos, which sparks even more conflict and terrorism. And what does all that conflict create? A huge market for the weapons industry.
It's this vicious feedback loop. The theory goes that by creating chaos and then selling the weapons to all sides to fight in that chaos, the system creates a state of permanent and very profitable war, while leaving countries like Iraq completely and utterly shattered. Which brings us to this final, really haunting question. When you look back at the last century of Iraq's history, from its creation by an empire to its destruction by an invasion, you just have to ask, in this great, terrible game, who really wins when a nation is broken?